Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and today I'd like to open with a quote from the great American philosopher Jack Handey. He says, "To me, it's a good idea to always carry 2 sacks of something when you walk around. That way, if anybody says, 'Hey, can you give me a hand?' you can say, 'Sorry, got these sacks.'" And if you understand why that quote is both funny and awesome, then it's going to be really easy to understand why Jesus is pushing back on the Pharisees' nonsense at the beginning of chapter 15. The deal is this. The religious leaders have got word all the way down in the headquarters of the religion in Jerusalem that something weird is going on several miles, several days walking journey up north in Galilee, where Jesus has been doing interesting things and teaching interesting things, all the stuff we've been looking at in Matthew so far. And the little local underling religious leaders have taken a stab at pushing back on him, but it hasn't worked. Jesus is too clever and these miracles are too convincing. And it seems like the whole world is chasing after Jesus, and the leaders of the synagogue, the religious leaders, just keep getting their butts handed to them. And so eventually they call in ringers from Jerusalem. And so these guys make the trip all the way up. They catch up with Jesus in Galilee, and the first thing they want to push back on with Jesus is the fact that his disciples are not washing their hands. And I don't want to make too much light of this. It seems ridiculous on its surface, but they had this whole set of extra biblical oral traditions and rules to make sure that no one accidentally took unclean things that were touched by unclean people or unclean animals and got that ritual uncleanness on them or in them by eating with dirty hands that might have somebody else's dirty dust on them. So they had a specific way they were supposed to wash their hands, even letting the water run off of their wrists to make sure it's perfect. And Jesus' disciples apparently did not wash their hands right. I don't know, maybe they didn't wash their hands at all. I have no idea. But it did not meet up to the hand-washing standards of these very fancy religious people from Jerusalem. And so they go to Jesus and they're like, what's the deal with your disciples? And this isn't the first time that we see the religious leadership question Jesus based on the behavior of his disciples. In fact, let me just bounce back just a tiny little bit here. And what is it? Chapter 12. Yeah, we get another controversy with the underling religious leaders who question Jesus about the fact that his disciples do what is unlawful on the Sabbath because they roll up grain in their hand and eat it as they walk through a field. So within 3 chapters, we have 2 different sets of religious leaders, but from the same religious, intellectual, political tribe, question Jesus about his disciples' behavior. And what we're going to see structurally in response to both is that Jesus pushes back on not just the nature of the question, but the heart behind the question, the motivation behind the question that these religious leaders are throwing at him, questioning the behavior of his disciples, and obviously, therefore, questioning like, hey, what are you teaching these guys? What are you really about? So the Pharisees asked this question. I'll just read it to you. Matthew 15, verse 1, "Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came up to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, 'Hey, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat.'" And this is where it gets really interesting and very much like the Jack Handey quote. Verse 3, Jesus replied, "And why do you break the commands of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, 'Hey, whatever help you might have otherwise received from me is a gift devoted to God,' he is not to honor his father with it. Thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your traditions, you hypocrites." And then he goes on to quote from the prophet Isaiah about the hypocrisy. Now, look, I know that what Jesus is referencing here is like crazy inside baseball. And I also know that that means that you might have been feeling that impulse just now to be like, oh, this is going to be one of those, it's just confusing. I don't get it already. But hang with me. I think it is very, very gettable. If you stare at this passage long enough without even going to any external resources, you start to figure out what's happening here. They come to him and they're like, well, we got this tradition and you're not washing your hands right. Why are your disciples doing that? What are you teaching them? And Jesus does not answer the question. He goes right back at them. And bear in mind, these people just made a very long trip, and we're no longer talking about minor leaguers here. These are the big leaguers. These are the ringers. These are the big guns. These are the people who are like, well, yes, he's dealt with the underlings, but send us up there. We'll deal with this brigand. So these are your fancy types, and they ain't used to being talked to like this, let alone out and out losing in a social debate style situation. This must have been stunning for Jesus to come at them with this kind of language. Everybody in the room would have known, based on the outfits and the reputations, exactly who Jesus was just telling off here. So he fires back, not even acknowledging the value of the tradition of the elders, but instead one-upping them. And like, hey, you want to talk about like important things? Let's talk about the word of actual God, who you acknowledge, whose word you openly violate. Now, here's where we get into the inside baseball. He's going to talk about something here that is not a practice that is immediately evident to you and me as readers now, but that would have been totally evident to the original audience. He says, for God said, and then it's Exodus 20-something, and Exodus 21 is probably down here in the footnotes. Exodus 20, verse 12, and Exodus 21:17. That's what he quotes from. And one of these is from the Ten Commandments, and then the next chapter over in Exodus is a reiteration of that particular commandment. He's like, hey, so we all agree that it is definitely God who said you're supposed to honor your mother and your father, and this is like center cut, most important commandments from God, that it's on that list. We all agree on that, right? We know that's from God. But you guys have this special exemption based on your, what did you call it again? The tradition of the elders? What the heck is that even? And this special exemption applies to people who want to donate money to you. And it looks from the text like this special exemption was such that somebody could get in a fight with their parents and be like, you're not getting anything from me. I'm not going to provide your first century version of Social Security or welfare, which was just kids meet the needs of your aging parents. You're not getting that. You offended me. You bothered me. You irritated me. Effectively, I am cursing you. I am banishing you to an old age of destitution and struggle because my money is devoted to God, and I've bound that with a sacred, unbreakable oath. Therefore, I simply can't give you that money. Well, it looks like, from some extra biblical stuff that I've looked at, and I think you can even see it between the lines here, it looks like the idea was that such a person who made such an oath would still have access to their money. And so what you have here is really some clever first century religious trust work. I mean, you know what a trust is, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that you can make, at least in American law, you can. I don't know if it's the same in other places, where you can have an entity that isn't really a person. It's a trust. A trust holds property. It holds money. And you can have certain types of trusts where you can move your resources into it. You gift your own personal resources into the trust. And if it's an irrevocable trust, you just can't get that back out. So let's say you move your house into your irrevocable trust, and then you rear end somebody and injure them badly, and they want to come back and sue you and take your house. They can't take your house because it was in that trust. Well, in an irrevocable trust, the downside of the house is you no longer have control over it. But there are some other types of trusts where you might be able to protect your assets by putting it in there, and now this entity owns your stuff, but you don't. So you have maybe reduced liabilities or reduced exposure to lawsuits or judgments against you, but also you still have some degree of access to all of these resources. It looks like, with a combination of some Old Testament rules and principles about making deals and oaths, and also some stuff from the tradition of the elders, there was this loophole that got figured out by which a kid could effectively disown his parents, revoke his obligation to be their Social Security and care for them in their old age as they had cared for him in his young age, and to use the synagogue, to use the temple as the workaround here. Like, no, I gave it to God. Too bad. I just can't help you, Mom and Dad. And so what Jesus is pointing out is, do you see the hypocrisy of this thing? Like, if you want to talk about the tradition of the elders as though it's so meritorious, and if you want to roll in here with your high and mighty judgmentalism as though you're so virtuous, well, let's just talk about not your tradition of the elders, but the fact that you are overtly, through your legal gerrymandering and maneuvering, you are overtly encouraging people and helping people to violate the obvious and explicit word of God straight out of the top 10 commandments that he ever gave, ever, period, that all of us agree is from God. So your weird, convoluted case law, legal, religious maneuvering has the net effect of empowering people to not do what God told them to do toward their parents because of some tradition you guys have. So Jesus isn't like, oh no, I'm really sorry that you criticized me a little bit. Instead, he comes right back and calls out you're carrying around those 2 sacks so that you don't have to help other people carry around 2 sacks level nonsense, which is demonstrated in this really fundamentally broken mindset that the religious leaders from Jerusalem were helping to empower people to do. Oh no, you made an oath. So yes, we would be glad to eventually receive that money from you as you age and to effectively empower you, reducing your parents to poverty. Because oaths are very, very important to the tradition of the elders. And, if we were to receive the financial benefits of such an arrangement and such an oath, I guess that would just be, is that who gets, I don't even know. Do we get the money? Oh, okay, that's fine. Jesus just crushes their hypocrisy and does not shame some minor leaguer, low-ranking religious leader type. He shamed the people who came up to beat him down and put him in his place. And the shaming is not even done yet. Every now and then we get to these parts of the Bible where I just have to step back and be in awe of the bravery of Jesus. So easy to imagine that if we warped back in time, we would strut around like Conor McGregor and we'd be like, yeah, I just tell everybody how it is. I'd be like, boom, this is how the Bible is. This is how everything is. You people are dumb and simple. I live in an age of sophistication and complication. And I get how no, you wouldn't. No, you would not. We are social people. I would not do that either. And if we did, it would be hubris and we'd come off as idiots. We do not swim in these waters. We are not better than these people. And within just a few minutes of being there, we would start to feel the social pressures and realities, much like we feel them now in whatever context you or I live in. We would not go back in time and be like Jesus and just tell everybody how the things are. Jesus was not like everybody else. He taught as one who had legitimate authority that transcended all of those social boundaries and things you're not allowed to say or think and people you're not allowed to push back on. He just did it. And yeah, ultimately he got canceled to the tune of getting killed. But even that was on purpose and led to something that was very, very intentional and that was part of the plan all along. I'm telling you, even if you disagree with me and you don't see deity in Jesus, you don't see him as being the Christ, the Son of God, as was confessed just a couple sentences earlier in Matthew chapter 14, I think we can still all agree that Jesus, as presented in the Bible, is incredibly brilliant and incredibly bold in the face of stuff that would cause most of us to shrink and wither. I got my first shipment of stuff in for the little books that we're sending out to all of the patrons who support the program at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. So again, patrons, please make sure that your addresses are up to date so that I can get that to the right place. Thanks for hanging out with me, everybody. More tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.